Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the quieter corners of history. So, if you're settling into bed, maybe fluff the pillow, let your phone dim itself a little, and let's take a slow walk through some very old mistakes. Because soldiers deserting their armies has been happening for as long as there were armies. And, unsurprisingly, the people in charge were never thrilled about it. Kings, generals, emperors, they had this funny little thing where they expected their men to stay in place and die for them. Desertion, on the other hand, was seen as the most personal kind of insult. And so, across the centuries, the punishments were creative, brutal, occasionally ridiculous, and sometimes a little bit ironic. So let's settle in. No rush, no drum rolls, just a steady meander through history's least committed soldiers, and the authorities who tried very hard and mostly failed to stop them. Let's begin in ancient Mesopotamia, because of course everything unpleasant usually starts there. Around 3000 BCE, city-states like Ur and Lagash had professional fighting men. Now, when we say professional, it's worth remembering that their main paycheck wasn't so much coins or steady wages as it was. You'll get to eat, and sometimes we'll give you land that isn't technically yours. Naturally, soldiers weren't always enthusiastic about this arrangement, and desertion was fairly common. The problem was, where do you even go? If you left the army, you'd be wandering through dusty fields, already branded a traitor, and very possibly bumping straight into another army. Records from clay tablets suggest that deserters were sometimes punished by being turned into slaves, which is one way of saying, you didn't want to fight for us voluntarily, so now you can haul bricks instead. Truly motivational. Now let's float over to ancient Greece. The Greeks loved rules. They also loved civic duty, and they were surprisingly obsessed with shaming. For example, in Athens, desertion, called lipotaxion, could mean the loss of your citizenship rights, which in Athenian terms was basically the end of your social life. No voting, no speaking in the assembly, no attending those charming festivals with wine and awkward dancing. Just you, forever marked as the guy who slipped out during battle because the Persians looked a little too tall that day. And because humiliation wasn't enough, the Greeks often liked to add a small public display. A deserter could be branded with a mark, or he could be fined into bankruptcy, or if his fellow citizens were really feeling dramatic, executed. But perhaps the cruelest punishment of all was simply being erased from the community. Because in ancient Athens, being invisible was sometimes worse than being dead. Sparta, of course, had its own unique approach. Spartans considered cowardice a hereditary disease, which is a very Spartan way of looking at things. If you deserted, or even if you just failed to fight as ferociously as they expected, you weren't executed on the spot. Oh no. Instead, you lived in permanent disgrace. You had to wear special cloaks to signal your shame. You were forced to give your seat to younger men, and everyone treated you like the human equivalent of spoiled cheese. In Sparta, social death was the preferred form of execution, and to the Spartans, that was probably worse than a spear through the chest. Now let's drift toward Rome, because the Romans never missed a chance to take a bad idea and make it worse. In the Roman legions, desertion was not just frowned upon. It was seen as an existential threat to the empire. A single missing man was an insult to discipline, and discipline was Rome's favorite word. So punishments had to be spectacular enough to terrify everyone else into compliance. One of Rome's most infamous practices was decimation. Now the name is misleading. It doesn't mean wiping everyone out. It means taking 1 man in 10 from a disgraced unit and killing him, usually by stoning or by clubbing carried out by his own fellow soldiers. Imagine standing in a circle with your friends, hoping the lot doesn't fall on you, and if it does, hoping your best friend is the one holding the club. That was Roman morale building. Very uplifting. For an individual deserter, the punishment could be crucifixion. Slow, public, and designed to make an example. But because Rome always had a flair for practicality, sometimes deserters were simply beaten to death by their own comrades to remind them all that trust in the unit mattered more than any one person's spine. And yet, despite all this theater of terror, desertion remained astonishingly common. Because when you ask men to march across half the known world, carrying 70 pounds of gear, surviving on rancid bacon, and then expect them to face Germanic tribes who are taller, angrier, and not wearing much at all, well, a lot of them decided the nearest vineyard looked much more appealing. Let's move gently east, to ancient China. The armies of imperial dynasties were vast, but morale was not always. Soldiers deserted often, sometimes in groups, especially during long campaigns against nomadic peoples. Chinese legal codes were, in their way, quite clear. Deserters could face branding on the face, mutilation, or execution. But punishments were not always carried out, because commanders needed bodies more than they needed statements. There are records of deserters being sent back into battle in the front lines, where the odds of survival were roughly as promising as a snowball in July. A particularly creative punishment during the Han Dynasty was to execute not only the deserter, but sometimes their entire family. Because nothing encourages loyalty like knowing your grandmother's well-being depends on you not running off at midnight. And yet, again, it didn't stop desertion. Because inconveniently, soldiers are human, and humans like not dying in someone else's war. Let's pause, take a slow breath, and wander into the Middle Ages. Medieval Europe was not exactly a paradise of discipline. Soldiers were often mercenaries, hired for a campaign, and then gone when the pay dried up. Which, naturally, was often. Desertion here was less about betraying the king, and more about sorry, but your coins are clearly counterfeit. Still, kings and captains were perpetually irritated by the sight of disappearing troops. Punishments varied. In England, deserters could be branded on the cheek with a hot iron, which must have made tavern small talk a bit awkward. Ah, yes, this scar. Just a little, battlefield sunburn. In France, the punishment was often hanging, though sometimes commanders liked to get creative with mutilation, because nothing says royal authority quite like chopping off a nose. But again, these punishments were inconsistent, because medieval kings were chronically broke. If they actually executed every deserter, they'd have no one left. And so, desertion was often quietly ignored if the deserter later returned when things looked less hopeless. Which means, in practice, medieval desertion was sometimes just an extended vacation. If we drift south to the Islamic world, say, under the Abbasid Caliphate, desertion had its own flavor. Soldiers were often slave soldiers, like the Mamluks, or mercenaries from distant lands. They didn't exactly have deep loyalty to the caliph, so desertion was treated as treason and punished harshly, usually by execution. Yet curiously, some deserters managed to resurface serving rival states where their skills were too valuable to waste. So, a deserter from Baghdad might simply become a commander in Cairo. The military job market was surprisingly fluid, provided you could avoid being recognized. Let's float forward to the early modern world. By the time of the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, desertion was practically a sport. Armies were massive, chaotic, and poorly supplied. Men deserted by the thousands. Sometimes they deserted, joined another army, then deserted again, like career freelancers with very sharp swords. Punishments were as brutal as ever, hanging, shooting, or breaking on the wheel, but they were rarely effective. Commanders wrote endless complaints about it, like irritated HR managers, and ordinary villagers caught between these wandering deserters learned to lock their barns, because hungry ex-soldiers were always happy to trade loyalty for a chicken. And so across history, what actually happened to deserters? The short answer is, punishments were terrible. Execution, mutilation, slavery, or humiliation. But the longer answer is that despite all the threats, desertion never really stopped. From Mesopotamia to the World Wars, soldiers slipped away whenever the risk outweighed the reward. And rulers, however cruel, never truly solved the problem. Because at the end of the day, armies are built on fear, but soldiers are built on the stubborn little hope of survival. And that hope, sometimes overrules the emperor's decree. So, As you drift off tonight, think about those tired, hungry men of the past, sneaking away from camp, hoping no one noticed, clutching a bit of stolen bread. Some were caught and paid the price. Some slipped away to start quiet new lives. And some probably just ended up in another army, wondering why all bosses seem to be the same. Now let's drift onward to another set of unfortunate royals and their unfortunate decisions. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake from part 1, congratulations. If you drifted off somewhere between the Spartans and the Romans clubbing each other to death, that's fine too. You're right on schedule. Tonight we're going to move a little closer to home, into the lives of medieval people, specifically their teeth. Yes, oral hygiene. The thing we all take for granted, with our little plastic toothbrushes and aggressively minty pastes. Medieval people, of course, had none of this. No Colgate, no mouthwash ads promising you fresh breath for job interviews, no reassuring dentist posters. They had bones, ashes, herbs, vinegar, and the occasional saint's recommendation. And yet, interestingly, their teeth weren't always as terrible as you might think, which honestly is a little unfair. So let's settle back, relax, and take a slow, slightly grim wander through the medieval mouth. We'll start with the basics. Did medieval people brush their teeth? The short answer, not in the way we do. There were no standardized toothbrushes until much later, when China developed bristle brushes in the 15th century. Medieval Europeans instead used a collection of improvised tools, a chewed stick, a cloth, sometimes just a finger. Yes, the medieval finger brush. You dip it into a powder, rub it around your teeth, and hope for the best. Not exactly glamorous, but technically it counts. What did they use as powder? A wide variety of substances that make modern dentists want to weep. Crushed bones, burnt hooves, charcoal, ash from firewood, crushed eggshells, salt, herbs like sage or mint, if you were lucky enough to find some growing nearby. In other words, the medieval version of toothpaste was essentially a handful of stuff swept off the floor and applied with enthusiasm. And, naturally, because humans never miss an opportunity to make things worse, some recipes included things like ground pumice stone, which, yes, would polish your teeth, and also gradually sand them away like an overzealous carpenter. But hey, smooth was smooth. Now, what about toothpaste flavors? Well, they weren't exactly spoiled for choice. A popular recipe in the 12th century recommended mixing honey with ash. That sounds lovely until you realize honey is sticky and sugar-rich, so it basically glued the ash into your molars for future cavities. Another medieval formula suggested wine mixed with vinegar and herbs, which is less toothpaste and more like accidentally gargling salad dressing. But let's give them credit. They knew breath mattered. Chronic halitosis was not charming then either, so people chewed parsley, fennel, or cloves. Wealthier folks carried little spice pouches to freshen their breath, which meant that if you were lucky enough to be rich, you at least smelled faintly of cloves rather than fermented onions. Dentists? Well, there weren't many. The medieval dentist was usually the local barber surgeon. And by dentist, I mean he would happily yank your tooth out while also offering a shave, a haircut, and possibly a casual bloodletting. Dentistry was not its own profession yet. If your tooth hurt, you went to someone who had pliers, which was less about medicine and more about brute strength. And extractions were brutal. No anesthesia, of course. Just clamping, pulling, and praying. Sometimes heated metal to cauterize the wound. Sometimes just stuffing herbs in the hole and hoping infection didn't carry you off. The idea of fillings existed only in the vaguest sense, with some attempts using resin or beeswax, but it was rare and usually temporary. So, medieval oral care was not about saving teeth. It was about losing them in the least inconvenient way possible. And yet, here's the twist. Medieval people's teeth were often healthier than ours. Yes, really. Archaeological remains show that many medieval skulls had surprisingly intact teeth. Why? Because sugar wasn't widely available in Europe until much later. Their diets were rough, gritty, often short on nutrition, but they weren't bathing their molars in processed sugar. So while modern people wrestle with cavities from childhood onward, many medieval mouths were cavity-free until later in life. Instead, they suffered from worn-down enamel, gum disease, and the occasional cracked tooth from biting into stone fragments hidden in their bread. Not glamorous, but less decay. Bread was especially to blame. Medieval flour was ground with stone, so little particles ended up in the dough. Imagine eating sandpaper toast every morning. Over time, it filed their teeth down. Archaeologists find medieval skulls where the teeth are worn almost flat, like pebbles in a riverbed, but oddly, not rotting. Let's talk about social status. Because, of course, everything in the Middle Ages came down to class. The rich indulged in imported sugar when they could. This was exotic, expensive, and predictably terrible for their teeth. Nobles and royals often had blackened molars thanks to their sweet tooth. Queen Elizabeth I, famously later, had such a love of sugar that her teeth turned black. And courtiers, ever eager to imitate royalty, sometimes blackened their own teeth on purpose. Because nothing says, "I'm rich," like looking like you've been chewing coal. The poor, meanwhile, ate coarser diets with more grains and vegetables. Their teeth wore down, but cavities were less common, which means that, ironically, the peasants sometimes had healthier mouths than their lords. Not that they noticed. They were too busy trying not to starve. Now, what about cultural attitudes? Did medieval people care about bad breath? The answer is yes, but selectively. Chronic halitosis was sometimes seen as a sign of inner sin, because naturally everything unpleasant was a sign of sin. Religious texts occasionally warned against foul breath as though brushing your teeth was a moral obligation. Poets and courtly writers also made jokes about it. There are references to ladies chewing spices before romantic encounters. Troubadours in their love songs occasionally hinted that sweet breath was part of beauty, which suggests that even in the candle-lit castles of Europe, nobody wanted to kiss a mouthful of onion fumes. Let's drift into remedies, because medieval medicine always had remedies, and they were often worse than the disease. Some manuals recommended rinsing your mouth with vinegar or wine, which, to be fair, wasn't the worst advice. Alcohol kills bacteria. Others suggested mixtures of herbs boiled in honey water. Not ideal, but at least aromatic. Less appealing, powdered burnt salt mixed with urine. Yes, you heard that right. Urine. In some folk traditions, human or animal urine was considered cleansing, so if you were unlucky enough to follow that advice, your daily routine involved gargling something I think we can all agree is less than refreshing. Of course, religion added its own spin. Monks often wrote about bodily care, and some monastic rules allowed for herbal rinses, but vanity was frowned upon. Cleaning your teeth was fine as long as you weren't being worldly about it, which meant that you could swish with mint leaves, but heaven forbid you brag about your minty breath at Vespers. And then there's the saintly approach. Some relics, like holy water or blessed oil, were thought to cure toothache. Pilgrims sometimes carried little vials of water from shrines, dabbing it on sore gums. Whether it helped is questionable, but at least it gave people an excuse to go on a nice long walk. So, to sum it all up, medieval people did brush their teeth in their way. They used sticks, cloths, and powders made of whatever was handy. They rinsed with vinegar. They chewed herbs. They visited the barber surgeon when things got really bad, and usually regretted it. Their diet spared them some of the cavities we face today, but left them with flat, worn teeth. and their attitudes toward hygiene were a mix of practical, superstitious, and occasionally hilarious. In short, they managed. Poorly, but they managed. So, as you're drifting off tonight, maybe after brushing your own teeth with your soft-bristled, mint-scented 21st century miracle stick, just remember, your medieval ancestors would have killed for that toothbrush, or at least they would have had it yanked from their jaw by a barber. Let's move gently now, away from the clove-scented court and the vinegar gargles and into another corner of history's oddities. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're somehow still with me, first of all, congratulations. If you fell asleep somewhere between medieval vinegar gargles and chewing on cloves, well, that was the point. Either way, we're back tonight, floating onward through another dimly lit corridor of history's peculiarities. And this time, we're looking at royalty. Specifically, why certain medieval kings seemed to have, let's call it, an unusual interest in collecting people who were either unusually small or unusually tall. Yes, dwarfs and giants, human beings turned into courtly curiosities, displayed, celebrated, sometimes mocked, sometimes oddly revered. Because medieval royalty could never just leave things at normal. They needed spectacle. They needed living proof that their courts were unlike anyone else's. And naturally, that proof often came at the expense of real human beings. So tonight, let's settle in, dim the lights, and wander quietly through some very strange royal households. Let's start with the basics. Medieval courts were obsessed with difference. If you were a king or a queen, your entire identity revolved around being set apart. You had the biggest jewels, the finest furs, the most unnecessarily pointy shoes, and so it followed that your household, too, should be full of marvels. Strange animals, exotic foods, rare objects, and unfortunately rare people. Among these were dwarfs, not simply as servants or entertainers, but as status symbols. To own, or employ, as they like to phrase it, someone with a strikingly different body was to signal your wealth and power. After all, ordinary people didn't have dwarfs wandering around their kitchens. That privilege was reserved for courts and noble halls. And it wasn't just about novelty. Dwarfs in medieval Europe were often thought to carry a kind of mystical aura. Folklore brimmed with tales of small, clever beings living in forests, mines, or under hills. By extension, a dwarf in a royal court could be cast as a token of wisdom, of luck, or of divine oddity. Of course, the reality was usually far less flattering. They were often reduced to jesters, made to perform, dressed up like dolls, and paraded around at banquets. But in the twisted logic of the medieval elite, it was considered an honor. One of the most famous early examples comes from the Byzantine court. Empress Theodora in the 6th century reportedly kept dwarfs in her palace, dressing them in elaborate costumes, almost like living treasures. The tradition filtered westward, and by the late Middle Ages it was well established that if you were a monarch worth your salt, you probably had at least one dwarf at court. By the 13th century, records of European courts list dwarfs by name. Alfonso X of Castile, for example, kept several. Charles V of France was said to have had dwarfs accompany him on hunts, partly for amusement and partly, bizarrely, to prove that even his leisure time was unusual. The Habsburgs, of course, because who else, took this to another level. The Spanish court in particular became infamous for surrounding itself with dwarfs. They weren't merely curiosities, they were fixtures. Some were immortalized in portraits by painters like Velázquez, who gave them a kind of dignity that the court itself rarely did. If you've ever seen Las Meninas, tucked among the princesses and courtiers, is a dwarf, Mari Barbola, gazing out with a directness that almost steals the painting. But let's not pretend this was kindness. Dwarfs were often treated as lifelong possessions, gifted between nobles, and sometimes literally purchased. It was commodification disguised as companionship. And then there were the giants. Giants held a different allure. While dwarfs were associated with wit or playfulness, giants embodied raw spectacle. A towering body in a medieval court was a living proclamation. Look at the wonders my wealth can command. Kings paraded them as proof of their reach, sometimes claiming they were brought from distant lands, sometimes exaggerating their height in stories until it bordered on myth. A man of 6.5 feet might be described as 8 or 9 feet, because of course, why let reality get in the way of good propaganda? Charles VIII of France is said to have employed a giant named Grandjean, who stood so tall that he had trouble entering through the palace doors. At banquets, his presence was part entertainment, part intimidation, because nothing says "welcome to my court" quite like placing an enormous man at the head of the table. Similarly, Margaret of Austria reportedly displayed a giant in her retinue, delighting in presenting him to visiting dignitaries. It was like a medieval version of showing off your rarest Pokemon card, except the card was a living person with sore knees and a lifetime of gawking stares. Now, here's where it gets stranger. Sometimes courts didn't stop at one extreme. They wanted both. There are records of royal households where dwarfs and giants were deliberately paired together to heighten the contrast. Banquets would feature a dwarf and a giant seated side by side, while the nobility chuckled into their spiced wine. It was symmetry as spectacle, proof that the king could command not just riches, but nature itself, bending the human body into curiosities for his table. There's a famous anecdote from the Burgundian court, where Duke Philip the Good reportedly staged exactly such a pairing. Guests were invited to marvel at the juxtaposition, as though human beings were stage props. And it wasn't just nobles. Court festivals often included dwarfs and giants as entertainers, woven into pageantry. Picture torchlit processions where dwarfs carried tiny banners, while giants hoisted enormous ones. The crowd would gasp, the courtiers would applaud, and somewhere in the background, an underpaid musician would sigh and play the lute. But why the obsession? Why did kings latch onto this so fervently? Part of it was simple spectacle. The medieval court was, in many ways, a theater. Nobility wasn't about subtlety. It was about being visibly extraordinary. If you could fill your hall with lions, leopards, jesters, dwarfs, giants, and fountains that sprayed wine, then clearly you were not like the peasants scraping mud off their shoes outside. Another part was symbolic. Dwarfs were sometimes seen as embodiments of fortune, tokens of luck, like a living talisman. Giants, meanwhile, symbolized might, the triumph of size and dominance. By surrounding themselves with both, monarchs could suggest that they commanded the full spectrum of nature's wonders. And yet another part was, well, boredom. Life in a palace was long, repetitive, and often politically suffocating. Monarchs were surrounded by flatterers, bureaucrats, and in-laws they didn't particularly like. So a dwarf trained to perform tricks, or a giant capable of drinking a gallon of ale in one go, provided desperately needed entertainment. It was cruel, yes, but it was also a distraction in a world where distractions were few. Let's not forget the darker undertones. While dwarfs and giants could sometimes rise to positions of trust, there are records of dwarfs becoming confidants or chamber attendants. Many more were treated little better than pets. They were given mocking nicknames, dressed in costumes, made to dance, sing, or juggle at command. Some were given away as diplomatic gifts. Imagine being handed over like a box of candied figs to smooth over a marriage alliance. That was the reality for some of these people. And because medicine at the time had no understanding of conditions like dwarfism or gigantism, superstition flourished. Some believed dwarfs carried prophetic insight. Others whispered that giants were cursed or touched by God. Either way, they weren't simply seen as people, they were symbols, bent to whatever meaning the court required. Yet, as with so many medieval oddities, there were contradictions. A few dwarfs did manage to carve out respected positions. Take the case of Jep, the dwarf at the court of King Christian IV of Denmark. He wasn't just a jester, he became something of a trusted favorite. Chronicles note that Christian treated him as part of the household, not just an ornament. Others, like Mari Barbala in Spain, achieved a kind of immortality through portraiture, forever staring back at us with a dignity that defies the court that once objectified her. But these were exceptions. For most, life at court meant being trapped between fascination and mockery, always visible, rarely respected. So, why were kings obsessed? Because medieval royalty was obsessed with being seen as different, as extraordinary, as rulers whose very households reflected a world bent around their power. And what better way, in their eyes, than to surround themselves with bodies that defied the ordinary? It was theater. It was symbolism. It was cruelty dressed as amusement. And yet, it leaves us today with a strange record. Portraits, chronicles, half-remembered names of people who lived their entire lives under the gaze of kings, queens, and courtiers. People who were never just themselves, but always somebody else's spectacle. So, as we drift away from this particular medieval oddity, let's soften the torchlight, quiet the banquet hall, and step gently back into the shadows. Because the royals may have obsessed over giants and dwarfs, but here, tonight, they are simply reminders of how power shapes perception, and how fragile it is to be turned into someone else's symbol. Let's drift onward now, to the next corner of history's curiosities.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're somehow still awake, first of all, congratulations. You've survived 3 rounds of medieval teeth, royal curiosities, and soldiers sneaking off battlefields. If you're only just joining us, well, you've missed a delightful parade of vinegar gargles, dwarfs, giants, and desertion punishments. Truly the perfect lullaby material. But tonight, we're going to slip even further back. Not just to the Middle Ages, not even to Byzantium, but to Rome. Specifically to the quieter corners of Roman life that rarely make it into the grand histories. Because while we're usually told about emperors, legions, and aqueducts, we don't often pause to ask, what did Roman children actually do all day? What kept them busy before the invention of brightly packaged plastic toys and electronic screens? The short answer is, quite a lot. And the long answer, well, that's what we'll drift through tonight. So tuck in, relax, and let's wander through Roman childhoods. First things first. Roman children did have toys, or at least their own versions of them. But the idea of toys, as we think of them today, rows of identical items churned out by a factory, didn't exist. Instead, Roman toys were a mix of handmade curiosities, natural objects, and tiny amusements that blurred the line between practical and playful. And, in true Roman fashion, even the toys were sometimes miniature versions of adult life. Because naturally, if your entire society revolves around preparing children to grow up fast, why wouldn't you start training them early with a wooden chariot or a doll arranged for an imaginary marriage ceremony? Let's start with the simplest things. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman children playing with nuts. Yes, ordinary nuts like walnuts or hazelnuts, small enough to fit in a child's hand, sturdy enough to roll across the floor, and common enough that no one minded if they were lost in a corner. Children used nuts the way later children would use marbles, tossing them into circles, rolling them in little games of chance, or clacking them together for noise. In fact, Latin writers even mention games called nusus relinquere, literally, to abandon the nuts. The phrase became a kind of shorthand for leaving behind childish things, as if to say, well, he's given up his walnuts, now he's a man. Which is both endearing and faintly ridiculous. Imagine your parents solemnly declaring that you've officially grown up because you no longer flick beans across the floor. But children weren't limited to nuts. Bones, specifically sheep or goat ankle bones, were another favorite. Known as astragali or knuckle bones, they worked a bit like dice. Children threw them into the air, caught them on the back of their hands, or counted points depending on how they landed. Adults played with them too, of course. Romans had a hard time resisting gambling, But for children, they were part toy, part training and dexterity, part way to kill time when adults were busy being serious. And when bones weren't available, small carved versions in ivory, clay, or wood could be substituted. It seems Roman children were not picky about the source of their entertainment, so long as something could be tossed, caught, or counted. Next, dolls. Roman girls, in particular, seem to have had dolls made of wood, ivory, or rags. Some were simple, little jointed figures with movable arms and legs. Others were surprisingly detailed, complete with carefully carved hair and even miniature furniture. Many of these dolls turn up in graves, especially of girls who died before marriage. Archaeologists have found them tucked gently beside the child, as though they were both companion and symbol, something to take into the next world. One striking example is an ivory doll found in Rome itself, carefully jointed and clearly cherished. She had been placed in the tomb of a young girl alongside her jewelry. The message was clear. Childhood, even brief, was worth marking. Of course, Romans being Romans, dolls weren't always just playthings. They were also rehearsal tools. Girls would sometimes dedicate their dolls to the household gods when they married, symbolizing the end of childhood, which is a charmingly practical way of saying, playtime is over, it's time for responsibility. For boys, play often mirrored soldiering. Little carts, wooden swords, and toy shields appear in records. A child might be given a miniature helmet or practice weapon, light enough not to cause real injury, but heavy enough to begin the lifelong training expected of young Roman men. It's easy to picture a group of boys running about with wooden swords, pretending to be legionaries while their mothers muttered about broken pottery jars and bruised shins. Because while Rome's politics may have been complex, some childhood things are universal. Animals, too, played their part. Pets in Rome weren't just for adults. Children kept puppies, kittens, birds, and even mice. In some cases, little cages for pet mice have been found, complete with wheels for running. The Roman child, it seems, enjoyed watching a small creature spin in circles just as much as a modern one might watch a hamster on a wheel. Dogs were especially beloved, often named with endearingly simple titles like Little One or Barker. For a child, a dog might be both companion and toy, a living playmate in a world without manufactured distractions. But perhaps the most universal toys were balls. Roman children loved ball games, from simple catch to more elaborate versions with rules. Balls were made of inflated animal bladders, stuffed leather, or stitched cloth. Some were small enough to toss easily, others were larger, more like exercise equipment. Writers mention games of keep away, where one child tries desperately to snatch the ball while others toss it over their head. It's a game children still play today, though modern playgrounds rarely feature togas. And just like modern parents, Roman parents sometimes complained about the noise. Martial the poet once grumbled about boys thumping balls against walls in the street below, disturbing his peace. Which means, at least in this one respect, the Roman world has not changed at all. Seasonal games also mattered. In winter, children played with little sleds, sliding down snowy hills outside the city. In summer, they splashed about in shallow rivers or fountains, supervised or not by adults. And then there were festivals. During Saturnalia, for example, children often received small gifts, candles, figurines, or sweets. These weren't toys in the modern sense, but they carried the same thrill, the joy of unwrapping something new, even if it was just a tiny wax doll. One of the most fascinating glimpses we have of Roman play comes not from archaeology, but from graffiti. On the walls of Pompeii, scratched by unknown hands, are little sketches of animals, of crude board games, of children's names surrounded by doodles. These marks suggest children not only played but also recorded their play, proudly etching their presence into the city's walls. One game board, carved into stone steps, shows a version of Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum, a kind of proto-backgammon. Children may have gathered in groups to toss dice and move pieces, squabbling over rules exactly the way children do today. So, what did Roman children play with before toys existed? They played with nuts, bones, dolls, carts, balls, pets, and anything their hands could transform into amusement. They raced sleds in winter, splashed in fountains in summer, and carved game boards into steps when no one was looking. And like children everywhere, they turned the world itself into a playground. Perhaps that's the best answer. Toys didn't need to exist. Children have always made them exist, from whatever scraps or treasures they found around them. So as we drift away from Roman streets, past the little scratches of graffiti and the forgotten dolls and tombs, let's leave the children to their games. Because whether in the shadow of the Colosseum or on a modern playground, play is one of history's great constants. And with that thought, let's drift onward again to the next peculiar corner of the past.